Beneath the ice of Greenland lies the frozen remains of a secret US plan to hide hundreds of nuclear missiles, capable of obliterating key points in the Soviet Union. The world wouldn't learn of this until decades later. This was an area built for secrecy, an area designed to protect the US from a potential attack of the Soviet Union. This was Project Iceworm. Okay, so to fully understand this, we have to go back. During World War II, the USSR and USA were allied to help defeat the Nazis. The Nazi expansion saw it taking over such lands as Norway, Denmark, and Poland. And during World War II, the US would work to free Greenland, seeing it for its strategic value and installing temporary weather stations and airfields on the island. All this aided in the Allied forces being able to beat back the Germans and end the war. However, with the end of the war brought massive economic collapse in Europe and the disappearance of much of the old colonial empires. It created a power vacuum, which saw two dominant powers emerge, the Soviet Union and the United States. Great, parties all around, right? Well, no. After the war, however, there became this divide. See, the alliance between the Soviet Union and America was not one of trust, but merely of convenience. The two powers with ideological differences caused suspicions to emerge. And after carving up the continent, the Soviets began to establish their own political control in Eastern Europe. By the late 1940s, the communists were installed from Warsaw to Sofia, creating a cordon of states loyal to Moscow along its western frontier. This wasn't just a political or ideological tactic, it was created to ensure a buffer between Moscow and Western Europe in the event of another invasion. With this, US leaders then began to worry that they may be vulnerable to a Soviet attack launched over the North Pole. But then they thought, hey, remember Greenland? We used it in our war with the Germans. Why couldn't we use it for our own defense? It's close enough to keep an eye on our man in the east. We could just buy it from Denmark. And the US would offer Denmark $100 million in gold bars for all these issues to go away. The Danes, however, did not go for this idea, and were like, dude, go away, we're not just giving you our territory. But we will let you use it with our permission, and this is the quote here. Until it has been agreed that the existing danger to the American continent has passed. Anyway, so the post-war relationship between the US and the Soviets continued to deteriorate. Greenland would be added to their list of primary Arctic basins. And officials at the time knew how important this was, just saying, within the next 10 years, the strategic importance of Greenland will increase progressively. The northern part of Greenland could provide a base area for the protection of strategic air operations, i.e. we need to keep our bombers here just in case. All this while in 1947 they would adopt the Truman Doctrine, pledging to support free peoples resisting subjugation. And in response, the US launched the Marshall Plan to help rebuild Western Europe on democratic and capitalist lines, seeing economic stability as the bulwark against communism. Okay, cool, so they're rebuilding countries, however, and this is a pretty big however. The concern around the states from the Soviets was so great that it resulted in two military blocs being formed, giving us NATO in 1949 with Denmark as a founding member, and the Warsaw Pact in the 1950s. At the time, NATO's defense posture was centered around deterrence, built on the belief that possessing overwhelming military capabilities could prevent war altogether. At the time, with the Truman Doctrine, it was believed that nuclear weapons should only be used as a last resort. That was until 1953, when Eisenhower became president. This was at the height of the Korean War, a brutal conflict which saw Soviet hostilities and expansion. It led Eisenhower to pledge to end hostilities there and wanted to contain the spread of communism. Having seen the mass losses the United States incurred during the Korean War, and the quadrupling of the military budget, Eisenhower was like, oh shit, these constant large-scale conflicts are getting pretty expensive. We need to do something different. And so to do this, he implemented the New Look policy, and it kind of worked. Between 1953 and 1957, the Army's share of the defense budget and manpower would be reduced. However, the Air Force saw its defense budget increase by at least 49% by the late 1950s. Eisenhower then began to shift the US away from conventional wars, and towards a less expensive nuclear defense-based system, one where nuclear weapons could be delivered to their targets by long-range bombers and rockets, emphasizing the reliance on strategic nuclear weapons. Anyway, so political tensions are heightening between the two powers when the US Secretary of State John Foster Dulles would coin the term massive retaliation to describe how the nation would respond to any military provocation from the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons. This was shifting away from the Truman administration's use of nuclear weapons as only last resorts, to instead be deliberately threatening with the use of these weapons even in local conventional conflicts that were initiated by the Soviet Union on her allies. And it made sense. At the time, the US believed that they held the upper hand in nuclear forces. That was until the late 1950s, when the Soviets made rapid advances in nuclear technology. In 1957, the USSR had its 40th anniversary of the October Revolution, and it crossed some massive milestones. The Soviets would carry out the first intercontinental missile tests, send the first satellite into orbit, and put the first life form, Laika the dog, into space, all in less than 6 months. With Sputnik transmitting the first satellite signal around the world, it forced the United States to watch in awe as to what the Soviets had done. The Soviets were winning the PR war and making serious technological advances, all while the US was failing to even launch their own satellites. All this meant that the balance of terror was now in place, and thus the stage is set, and let's start talking about Project Iceworm. Project Iceworm was the Army's plan to be able to have a distinct nuclear role inside the Defense Department. Remember how the Army lost its budget? Well, this is how they wanted to get it back. So while the Air Force dominated with strategic bombers, and the Navy was developing the Polaris submarine launch missile, the Army found its place in the Arctic. Project Iceworm was conceived as a hidden nuclear missile deployment system under Greenland's ice sheet, stretching over an area larger than the state of New York, with as many as 600 nuclear missiles hidden within. The missiles would be medium-range ballistic missiles, or MRBMs, each with a nuclear warhead capable of striking targets such as Moscow and Leningrad. The Army planned a tunnel network across 52,000 square miles, an area roughly the size of England. Each missile was to be housed on a mobile launcher on rails within the tunnels, allowing for missile launches to move constantly, making them extremely difficult for the Soviets to locate and destroy. The launch sites would be covered by retractable ice hatches, for missiles to be fired without exposing the overall network. That was the plan, and right here, Camp Century would be as a proof of concept for the engineering capabilities. Officially, it was just a scientific station, just taking materials and geological tests. Nothing out of the ordinary, right? Initially, the construction of a military base called Thule began here, on the eastern coast of Greenland. Thule was completed in around 3 months, with approximately 12,000 people working on it. It was a massive operation. Then, in 1959, approximately 150 miles to the east of Thule, they began the construction of Camp Century. Camp Century would be made nearly 100 feet below the surface of the ice, something that had never been attempted before. It was a large camp with multiple stations to house men and supplies. The construction began slowly as large sledges moved along the ice, taking approximately 70 hours to reach the base after transportation, and moving loads between 50 and 100 tons. At the end of the convoy, the initial structure would be dug into the snow by snowplows imported from Switzerland, connecting the facility with 23 trenches. In the centre was the main trench, to provide joining areas for different segments of the base. There was accommodations, technical facilities, and even a small nuclear reactor to give the base power. Oh, and this reactor, by the way, caused a massive upset inside the Danish government. The entire time the Danish government suspected that the US was up to much more than just creating a scientific outpost, and this led to heaps of arguing between the two countries, but eventually the Danes kind of chose to turn a blind eye and kind of not, but we'll get to that later. So they dug into the snow, creating channels and tunnels, placing metal arches over the top of the trenches to provide roofing. This would then be covered to become invisible with the barren snowscape. Then in 1960, the foundations for wooden flooring would be made and prefabricated housing imported and constructed. Then finally the tunnels were blocked off at the ends with snow, making it invisible to the outside world. There was even a documentary created to show the American public. Several actually, and they're quite good. I do recommend watching them if you have the time. And then it just ended. Project Iceworm didn't really last long, only from around 1958 to 1966. It would eventually be shut down prior to the creation of the nuclear launch pad, mainly due to technical and engineering problems such as the shifting movement of the ice creating structural instabilities within the walls. One person commented on how the walls of the tunnels would bow inwards and the roof sagged, leading to constant clearing and rebuilding of the tunnels. Over decades of life, it would have proved logistically infeasible and prohibitively expensive. Additionally, the power logistics were difficult to deal with. While the nuclear reactor brought to the base was technically feasible, maintaining the reactor under the ice posed serious risks, especially if scaled up to hundreds of nuclear sites. There's also this massive issue with the Danish government. They were constantly suspicious around the real purpose of the base and believing it would be used for other purposes and not just strictly research. The Danish government would send officers to review the operations and confirm the works. Additionally, the Danish people were not happy about the base and the government feared backlash around it. This led to the Danish government requesting control over editorial documents which were published by journalists from the United States, leading to clashes between the government and the press. The US nuclear deterrence also moved towards a triad system using land-based ICBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and strategic bombers. And the success of the Navy's Polaris SLBMs provided similar secondary strike capabilities without the potential risk of foreign bases. Additionally, by the mid-1960s, the Minuteman ICBMs and Polaris SLBMs were cheaper and easier to maintain, all while the Soviet ICBMs improved accuracy. Fixed location systems such as the base became more vulnerable, and Iceworm's scale made it hard to conceal entirely. And so by 1966, the program was quietly abandoned. For decades, the project remained classified, and the public narrative remained that Camp Century was purely just a research station. The real military purpose only became known as documents began to be declassified, with Danish researchers, journalists, and eventually the government pressing for further details. The Foreign Ministry officially acknowledged that the US had stored nuclear weapons in Greenland during the Cold War, contrary to Denmark's stated nuclear-free policy. The camp was abandoned in 1967. When Camp Century was abandoned in 1967, the US left behind all infrastructure and waste, under the assumption that it would remain entombed forever in the ice. This included the PM2A nuclear reactor's radiological waste, diesel fuel, sewage, and other hazardous materials. However, a 2016 study found that as the ice melted, it could eventually release and expose Camp Century's buried waste, with concerns that part of the sheet may break off and form an iceberg, sending material into the environment. When the Americans left Camp Century, they left behind everything but the nuclear reactor core, believing it would forever be preserved in the ice. Now the ice is melting, the abandoned infrastructure and waste may one day return to the surface. So that's it. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments if you found it interesting, and like and subscribe. Thanks.